Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending where you all are. My name is Joanna King, and I am from the program department here at Amerikahaus. We're very excited to welcome you all to our event with Karen Greenberg, the dismantling of American democracy since 9/11. Karen Greenberg is an expert on national security, terrorism, and civil liberties, and director of the Center on National Security at Fordham Law. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, The Nation, The National Interest, Mother Jones, TomDispatch.com, and on many major news channels. Her book, Subtle Tools, The Dismantling of American Democracy from the War on Terror to Donald Trump, investigates how policies forged after September 11th were weaponized under Trump and turned on American democracy itself. And this is the topic that Karen Greenberg will be discussing with us tonight. We're really looking forward to it. I want to let everybody know that you're welcome to ask Karen Greenberg questions at the end of this event. You can post those questions in the YouTube live chat and we will relay them to Karen, or you may send them to event@amerikahaus.de. That is event at America with a K, AMERIKAHAUS.de. Without much further ado, I would like to pass it on to Karen Greenberg. Thank you so much. We're glad that you're here.
Thank you so much, Joanna. And thank you so much to Amerikahaus. I want to just say a few words to start, which is that I started my scholarly work studying the relationship between the United States and Germany, and particularly the relationship between the university communities in Germany and the United States from the 19th through the 20th century. So it's really just a perfect moment for me to be here, and I'm really quite delighted. So I'm going to be talking to you today about my new book, which is called Subtle Tools. And basically what my book argues overall is that we can talk all we want about the policies that were created by the United States in the name of the war on terror and in the name of national security and strengthening the country's national security. And we can tweak those policies, we can sunset those policies, we can rethink those policies. But my perspective is that the way they were brought about poses as much of a danger to American democracy as the policies that resulted. And so this book is about the tools that were used, that we didn't quite see, that were behavioral mechanisms, that were forms of subterfuge, et cetera, that we still live with to this day, and that left on the table for use by future presidents, and even current presidents and administrations, can be very dangerous. So the first part of the book looks at the war on terror and names what the subtle tools are, the beginnings of the war on terror, and sort of brings you into the culture of governance that was created after the attacks of 9/11 that happened in 2001. And the second part of the book takes you forward into domestic policies and foreign policies, often unrelated to the war on terror, not always, but often unrelated to the war on terror, and how you see the same kind of tools being used for very different ends, unrelated to counterterrorism or anything initially used to justify those tools. So let me tell you what the tools are, how they came about, and then I'm looking forward to a discussion at the end of this with all of you. So there are foundational pieces of legislation that were put in place that reflect some of these tools. And those foundational pieces of legislation are three. They are the Authorization for the Use of Military Force, which the United States passed soon after 9/11 in order to justify the invasion of Afghanistan in pursuit of Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, those who were responsible for the 9/11 attacks. It was the Patriot Act, which was passed in October of 2001, which defined what law enforcement could do, expanded their powers exponentially in the name of the war on terror. And it was the Homeland Security Act, which was passed in 2002, in the fall of 2002, which created a department that was ostensibly there to address terrorism issues and terrorism threats, and maybe even national security threats. And so I'm going to talk about the way these pieces of legislation were brought into being, obviously with subtle tools. The biggest subtle tool that I talk about, or the first one I talk about, is the abuse of language, and in particular, the use and reliance upon imprecision, vague, imprecise, unenumerated powers and terms that were welded into each piece of legislation that I talked about. Most notably, let me talk about the authorization for the use of military force that was passed, as I said, in the days following 9/11. And basically, it empowered the president to make the decision on who to attack in the name of responses to the 9/11 attacks. It did not name an enemy. It did not name a geographical location, although it was intended for Afghanistan. It did not name any kind of temporal framework. And along those lines, it did not refer to the ends of hostilities. Now, just so you know, this is in contradistinction to any authorization for force or any authorization for war that had occurred prior to this in US history. It was very unusual not to name an enemy, at least to name a geographical location, and to refer to the end of hostilities in one way, shape, or form. Not surprisingly, when you create a piece of legislation this broad, this vague, this imprecise, it's able to be expanded at will, which successive presidents did. The authorization for the use of military force that was passed in 2001 has been used in more and more countries. It's been used in Pakistan and Yemen and Syria, and I could go on, and Niger, and it still exists to this day. The United States may have pulled out of Afghanistan, but the authorization, or AUMF that we call it, from 2001 still persists. There has been talk in the US Congress in recent months, prior to the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan, of no longer relying on the AUMF and maybe even voting it down and perhaps replacing it with something else. The messiness of the backlash from the withdrawal in Afghanistan may make this a little more difficult, but the fact is we now have an authorization for force that was tied initially to the Afghan context, if not in language, and that is now can be used in a variety of places around the world without the president having to go to Congress. As many of you may know, it is Congress's right to declare war and the president's right under the Constitution to be the commander-in-chief during the war. So this is a problem launched and a lane of confusion launched right after 9/11. I call this the document, the foundational document of the war on terror, and so much else that we have seen is tied to this love of or recognition of the power that can come from vagueness and imprecision. And I mean, I could fast forward to you of ways that has been used in other presidents, but let me just focus for a moment on one of the ways Trump used it that was tied to the war on terror, and that was the use of imprecise language and of an inability to recognize limits when it came to the Muslim ban. So that rather create a set of criteria by which you could or couldn't come into the country, he just with a broad swath sort of said, anybody from these countries, with very few exceptions, as they named after time, is banned from coming to the United States in the name of counterterrorism. And so we've seen this sort of vagueness used for expansiveness, used for defining who the enemy is as we decide to define them going abroad from then until very recently. And there's more that I can, if I have time, talk about going forward. A second piece of the subtle tool arsenal is secrecy. This is probably the one that most of you have heard the most about, the war on terror and Bush administration's serious embrace of secrecy in the name of national security. The most egregious use of this secrecy was to create with legal documents, to implement with the use of established parts of the Bush administration, and to cover up the torture policy. And this is not just some kind of minor aberration. The decision to use torture, which was illegal under domestic law, international law, and military law, needed to be done in secret, or the understanding was that it wouldn't have been able to be implemented. And I think that's probably very much the case. And it wasn't just that it was created in secret or that it was implemented in secret. It was also how it was treated throughout every single chapter of how the United States has dealt with torture. So we don't really know, although what evidence was obtained through torture or not obtained, what wrong evidence was obtained. We have bits and pieces, but not a lot of it. Much of the evidence that we would have was destroyed by the CIA. The tapes of the interrogations were destroyed. When Congress finally got around to creating an investigation and looking into torture and the secret mechanisms that have brought it about and trying to expose what had happened, the report came out. It was 6,000 pages, but most of it hasn't been seen. We've seen a more than 500-page executive summary, but the kinds of details that you'd really want to know to assess this program, to understand what it was, to understand what the violations were and how they came about, has not really been vetted with the American public. And during the presidency of Donald Trump, many of the copies were destroyed. There is a copy preserved in the Obama Presidential Library, but that won't be open for much time to come. Secrecy under Obama did take a step backwards. Obama came into office and basically said, look, we need transparency in government. On his second day of his presidency, he issued a presidential memoranda saying secrecy is important to the essence of American democracy, and this administration is going to do everything in its power to be more transparent. But as with so much in the Obama administration, intentions proved very hard to realize. And there was so much secrecy over different things throughout the Obama administration, and more importantly, the kinds of safeguards that needed to be put in place so that this couldn't happen again, this level of irresponsible and law-breaking secrecy, were not put in place. So it wasn't particularly surprising when another president came in and took secrecy to a whole new level. When President Trump came in, he understood the value of secrecy in being able to protect the government from any kind of repercussions. And rather than just hide documents, he went out of his way to make sure documents weren't created. So, for example, you may know that John Bolton wrote in his book about how meeting with Putin and Trump about many issues, no notes were allowed to be taken. We've seen references to this from other officials that served in the Trump administration. Similarly, and in very different contexts than foreign affairs, we saw that at the border, records were not kept at the southern border of the United States. So when families were separated, children from their parents, there was no record kept in many cases. And as a result, reuniting these families has been a particular challenge. But it all goes to the idea of what secrecy is and how far can a president and an administration take it. We've also seen this embrace of secrecy in not allowing White House officials to testify before Congress, as happened during the Trump administration on obstruction of justice charges related to the Mueller report. And we've seen it in many other contexts as well. So in other words, from secrecy, hiding evidence, destroying evidence, we've got to the place as a country where evidence wasn't created. This is a very dangerous role. And until it very possibly that Joe Biden will decide not to embrace this level of secrecy, but no matter what happens, unless provisions are put in place that make it accountable for such policies, or make it so that regulations provide that we can't institute policies except in very narrow circumstances, the United States remains vulnerable to this kind of destruction of the record going forward. A third subtle tool that I talk about is institutional imprecision. And the term I use for this is sort of a heavy term, but I will explain it to you, called bureaucratic porousness. And I really meant it to encompass a very large-scale sense of erosion of integrity between one department of the government and another department of the government, between one office and another office, between one branch and another branch. And so the best way to understand what I mean, but not the only way to understand what I mean by this sort of institutional imprecision, is the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, which was outlined and drafted in the fall of 2002, as I referred to earlier. The Department of Homeland Security was created out of numerous different offices, agencies, and departments that spanned from Health and Human Services to agriculture to defense to the Department of Justice to Treasury and many more. And as you can tell from the list of departments that I'm mentioning to you, it was hard to imagine what authorities, what mission was being put in place. It came under the rubric of making the country safer, something that for the months and years after 9/11 became of utmost concern for, I think, understandable reasons to government officials. But when they created the Department of Homeland Security, they put in so much that actually making it function, as many people on the floor of Congress warned about when it was being put together, that it was hard to really understand what this entity was. Now, 20 years later, the department, or almost 20 years later, the Department of Homeland Security is the largest law enforcement agency in the United States. It's also worth noting that when they put together this mega structure for countering terrorism in the homeland, what they did was to not include the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which is the lead agency for terrorism when it comes to terrorism on domestic soil and also with ties abroad. So you almost get the sense that it was created with the idea that we needed flexibility as a country to be able to deter threats. We could put in all these different offices, and then there would be a way to sort of go in whatever direction we needed. The result was quite the opposite. And the lines of command, the actual authorities, who had law enforcement authorities, who didn't, who actually directed this beyond the Secretary of Homeland Security, what other agencies they interacted with, and to what extent, was all very confusing. And this is something that Hurricane Katrina made very clear when it hit New Orleans in 2005. The Coast Guard, which was then in Homeland Security, moved to off of New Orleans, but waited there for orders to be able to come in and help. The same thing with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management groups, that no one knew who to give the orders, who was going to give the orders. And the result was a disaster. And many people died. And they tried to fix many of the chain of command issues afterwards, but it was a warning sign. And to this day, Department of Homeland Security is an agency that, in the very imprecision of its creation and imprecision of its operation, can be used however the president wants it to be used. So, for example, President Trump decided to allow border agents that were inside Department of Homeland Security to deputize others without the necessary training, to just grow the agency and to use these guards at the border. For immigration was put in Homeland Security. They were created, new immigration authorities inside Homeland Security, but the pivot and focus towards immigration was possible from the very beginning. And then those same agents were sent to Portland for the Black Lives Matter protest. And I think you get what I'm saying. It was sort of became a usable tool for the president to be able to deploy wherever he wanted, whatever the circumstance, whatever the specialty, whatever the mission. And we still live with the Department of Homeland Security and that kind of imprecision. And then the final tool that I wanted to talk about was the willing embrace of bypassing laws and norms. And in many ways, you could say that each one of these prior tools stands for a willingness to embrace laws and norms. But I argue that even in addition to these tools and how it came about, the willingness to push aside precedent, to push aside constitutional protections, to push aside laws and norms with abandon is something that needs to be seen in and of itself as a tool. And so I thought I would go through some of the ways that we see this happen. I will come back to to torture for a moment, that's sort of the obvious one. Instituting torture is bypassing laws, norms, and not to mention the character of the country in some very quintessential ways. But here's the moment, I think, where we have to talk about Guantanamo as well, which was created not in secrecy, in the open light of day, but violated some very fundamental ideas about American law and American culture. And I just want to talk a little bit about how language was used in the imprecise language was used to violate the law and push aside the norms in Guantanamo. So, for example, when the detainees arrived at captives, I should say, arrived at Guantanamo Bay in January of 2002, the order came down to the military that had received these first groups that they couldn't call them prisoners. That's how they came up with the name detainee at first, and eventually it morphed into a more legal terminology, unlawful enemy combatants. But the first missive was, don't call them prisoners. Detainees are okay. You might come up with another term, but don't call them prisoners. Why was that? Because if they were called prisoners, they would be able to have wartime protections under the Geneva Conventions. And that was just something that the Pentagon and the administration wanted to avoid at all costs. So set up, and also, although it was created in the open, the layers of secrecy over what was happening at Guantanamo have persisted actually very much until today, with better or worse periods. And when you want to talk about bureaucratic imprecision, what was Guantanamo? Because it existed outside known laws, because it not just international law and the treatment of prisoners, but American fundamental principle of not having indefinite detention without charge or release. It so fundamentally violated norms, and it still to this day exists in a legal limbo that it sort of makes it very hard to move on. That I think Guantanamo, as much as torture, and in some ways in a more persistent way, has symbolizes the willingness of the US government to bypass laws and norms in the name of national security and the war on terror. Again, President Obama very much wanted to close Guantanamo, saw the need to do it in a way that was procedural, and didn't make it happen. He miscalculated. We can talk about this later if you want. He miscalculated, I think, the political backlash that was going to face him, and maybe he should have done it in a quieter way, not announcing on his second day in office, we're going to close Guantanamo, within a year. The intention was there. The reality proved much harder, although his administration did eventually, in the last 18 months of his presidency, release nearly 200 prisoners from Guantanamo Bay. But this bypassing of procedural laws and procedural norms is something that doesn't usually rise to the level of policy decisions, and is a subtle tool that needs to be acknowledged. So let me take it into the presidency of Donald Trump and talk about it a little, because he had an exquisite sense of what it meant to bypass procedural laws and norms. And I want to just, focus on the norms to some extent, but also on the law. They sort of go together here. So one way, and I'm not going to have time to talk about all of this, but one way was that his administration was particularly heavy-handed when it came to interfering with what was going on in the courts. So the Solicitor General, the top litigator for the country, and the Attorney General, and en route to the Supreme Court, found ways to interfere with cases, particularly in the immigration sphere. But also in the Muslim ban sphere. Muslim ban is decreed by Donald Trump early in his presidency. A number of courts around the country say, we're putting a hold on this. We need to litigate this and see if this is unconstitutional or unlawful even. And that willingness of the federal government to interfere rather than to wait for cases to go from the lower court to the appellate court and eventually up potentially to the Supreme Court was a sign of really not respecting the processes that were put in place by the founding fathers and that were adhered to for much of the country's history. But it wasn't just interference in the courts. It was also a bypassing of Senate. So, for example, many positions at the top levels of government are required to have Senate confirmation. Constantly, Donald Trump would avoid this process. He did it in a number of ways, but the most obvious way was to have an acting person in the role, and then another acting person in the role, and then another acting person in the role, and to sort of play musical chairs with top officials. If you play this out in terms of political theory, what does this do to the functioning of government? It makes every single position dependent on the president in a way that has no senatorial, congressional backing. And also allows a kind of ad hoc presidency who can do things at will on a whim. So at the beginning of Donald Trump's last year in office of 2020, 24% of the positions requiring Senate confirmation had no nominee in place. And that, in essence, is something I think that the country is going to look at when it looks at what happened on January 6th. Because many of these positions involve positions that had some control over what would have been an appropriate response to January 6th in terms of security forces, law enforcement forces, and the rest. So I think this is something that we're going to hear more about going forward. My fear is that they won't look at the process itself, the tool itself, they'll just look at the result, but maybe not. I think one of the more interesting bypassing of procedural norms that took place during the Trump presidency took place early in 2020, and that was the killing of top Iranian general Qasem Soleimani. Because normally, if there is such a thing as a norm that takes this high national security decision in place, what would happen is there would be a meeting or several meetings or a series of hierarchical meetings within the National Security Council. And eventually they would come up with recommendations about should this kind of attack take place? What authorizes the use of force? Would it be one of the authorizations from 2001 or the authorization for Iraq in 2002? What would be the lawful authorization for this use of force? Would it be commander-in-chief powers? And then it would sort of lay out how what the processes would be, and everybody would be brought into the discussion, the various departments, the Pentagon, the State Department, and so on, in terms of who had a stake in what the intelligence agencies, of what the consequences of such a proposed targeted killing would be. For people inside the national security establishment, the name of General Qasem Soleimani was not new. He was known for deploying proxy terrorist attacks in numerous places against American allies and U.S. targets, and particularly recent, just before this authorized attack in January of 2020. But the absence of process in making the decision is something we should pay attention to. Donald Trump was at his Florida retreat in Mar-a-Lago. A couple of people from Congress showed up. There's no sense of what the interagency discussion was. There's no sense that everybody who had to be consulted was at the table in the discussion at the same time. There's a lot we don't know, but the optics make it seem that the real process that should have taken place was avoided. And another thing that makes this seem really like there wasn't a lot of vetting in the normal way that you need and customary way that you need to, and responsible way that you need to have such vetting was afterwards. After the strike, journalists, Congress, the American public, many asked, what were the authorities under which this attack was executed? How did this come about? And everyone gave a different answer. Secretary of Defense, Acting Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, gave one answer to NPR and then reversed his answer and went on again and gave a different answer. Pompeo gave one answer. Trump's immediate people in the White House gave another answer, because it seemed they hadn't really come to an idea about what they were going to justify this with. What they had decided was they were going to attack and kill Qasem Soleimani. So I think that is a very important way of understanding it. Now, these are the four subtle tools. The question is, why do they matter? what are they all about? And let me tell you why they matter. They matter because one of the things that they are all, they all have sort of two things that they really want to do. One is to expand the powers of government. So if you use vague and imprecise language, who's to say what you can't do, right? For example, how can't you use the authorization of military force? It's not there. For example, how can't you use the Patriot Act? Can you use it, as the United States did and the NSA did, to surveil countless amounts of Americans without a warrant? What can't you do if it doesn't say what you can't do? One thing about the founding fathers who wrote the Constitution that was very clear to them was the need for precision. They talk about it constantly. You can read about it in the Federalist Papers and elsewhere. Precision, enumeration, clarity. The idea of vague and ambiguous powers is not a prescription for a responsible government. And that's what we've seen since 9/11 to now. And it may be the case that, as Obama's sense was, that I'm going to behave. I know what the rules are. I know what the laws are. I teach constitutional law. I'm a lawyer. It's not enough. So that's one thing, is expansive powers. And we've seen this. And by the way, we may continue to see this. It's something to look for going forward. And the other thing is the intense sort of sense of accountability and unaccountability. In other words, you can't question this. You're not allowed to question the government. And if you don't have the evidence, and if it's done in secret, and if you have imprecise language, and if you have expansive powers, and if you have bureaucratic porousness, where do you get the accountability to come from? Where do you get Congress or the courts to want to weigh in? And numerous times throughout the war on terror, Congress and the courts issued opinions, decisions, memorandum saying, it's not our job to weigh in on national security. We're not going to do that. This is something that's the administration knows best how to do, and we're going to let them do it. And so the deference and the willingness to allow for unaccountability has been quite profound. When President Obama came into office, and so much had already been revealed about what had been kept secret, what had been outside the law, what had been outside norms, he faced the challenge of, do I address this? Or what do I do? And if I address it, how am I going to address it? Am I going to go to the Department of Justice and start to talk about prosecuting those who said that torture was legal, or those who administered this from inside government? Is that what I want to spend my presidency doing? Do I really want to create that kind of mess and chaos and diversion from the agenda I have in mind? And he decided ultimately no, or in his words, we're going to look forward and not backward. And ultimately, I think it turns out, given the fact that these tools are still here, and given the fact that we've watched the Trump presidency abuse them in such egregious ways, we don't really have the option or the luxury of only looking forward. We have to look backwards in many ways. Dianne Feinstein's torture committee that looked into the interrogation policy was a beginning for doing that. But if it remains classified, who knows what that really means. So this idea of being unaccountable is not just about, well, let's get the bad guys. It's not about it. You know what? A truth commission could establish the same thing. But more than that, it has to be saying these things are not just wrong morally. They're not just wrong in terms of our political consciousness. These are wrong because the following regulations, laws, and rules says that if you do them, this is what happens. You lose your job, the policy ends, whatever it is. There needs to be accountability built in to the system and the structure itself. And we haven't seen that. So one of the things that I think a question that really comes up now is what does it look like now going forward? And I think a lot of people ask, what about the Biden presidency? Is it just going to be this sort of cyclical, there's good guys and bad guys and people who want to abuse power and people who don't want to abuse power? So I wanted to spend a few of my remaining minutes talking a little bit about this in terms of some of the things that we've seen in the past in terms of these subtle tools. The first is the withdrawal from Afghanistan. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, in my opinion, has a significance for all of this beyond what many have absorbed or are talking about. Because yes, it's significant that troops were pulled out. Some would say a decade after they should have been. Some, like myself, would say nearly 2 decades after they should have been pulled out, namely when the advances against al-Qaeda were so pronounced late in 2001. But what happens now with the authorization for that war is actually very important, because one of the things the United States has not been able to do is to look itself in the eye and say, the 9/11 period is over. And because it's over, certain things about it can now be looked at. We're not dragging them in to the future. And so the withdrawal from Afghanistan is really very important in this regard. And what does happen with the authorization for the use of military force going forward is also extremely important. And I noticed that there's sort of like a pause in talking about it because it's been up for discussion. But I think watching this and seeing what happens is very important. And if it does get renewed, it needs to have the opposite of imprecision. It needs to have clarity. It has to name an enemy. It has to name a battlefield, however big. It has to refer to the possible end of hostilities, not an opening to forever wars. These are just some of the pieces of clarity I think it will need. Going forward, there has to be a real attention to how much gets classified within government and on what grounds. George Bush classified, they say, I don't know how you do this, but more documents during his presidency than all prior presidents combined. He did classify an inordinate amount of documents, many under national security. Classification remains a very easy out for officials throughout government, with the idea of you're just safer to classify it rather than to make things transparent. This is a fundamental tenet of American democracy that we really need to look into. Bureaucratic imprecision is also extremely important going forward. So let me give you some examples of how Biden, in some ways, or his administrations, has started to address this, and some ways in which they're caught in the middle of what this bureaucratic imprecision was. That bureaucratic porousness or imprecision was not just within the Department of Homeland Security. It was also between different entities of government, some of them state versus local. And you saw this in the Donald Trump presidency, where this intense fights between who could interfere with National Guard going to localities. Did the governors call them in? Did the president have the power? Where exactly did this lie? And we never had a full discussion of it, which the country needs to have. We've seen it with the election. We're seeing it now with contesting the election. Who's going to make these ultimate decisions? The states, which control their elections. Where does federal policy fill in? And well, by the way, we're seeing it in our country right now with abortion policy and what's going to happen with abortion. But we're also seeing it within the executive itself. What happened during the war on terror and what happened particularly during the Trump administration was an eradication of the boundary between the Department of Justice and the White House. What the White House wanted, Jeff Sessions and William Barr, particularly William Barr, did. And this is not how the government is supposed to be construed, particularly in terms of understanding checks on the presidency. The Department of Justice is supposed to be there to represent the law, not the politics and the whims of the president. And one of the first things that Merrick Garland has done is to issue an order basically outlining what the independence of the Department of Justice needs to look like from the White House, and the procedures that will be put in place, and the kinds of regulations that will now regulate what's going on in terms of in terms of going forward with communications. Obviously, there has to be some kinds of communications, particularly on heightened national security matters. But the importance of that Garland memo is to not just separate the Department of Justice from the White House, but to do so in a way which recognizes limits, clarity, and procedures. And so in a way, I see this as a very important symbolic step forward. We'll see what else can happen. And then I think, finally, one thing we have to think about, and I always think about it because I wrote a book on this and it's just always been with me, is looking forward how this administration is dealing with not just the war in Afghanistan, not just the internal politics spawned by the war on terror and its excesses, but also that symbol of the war on terror, which is Guantanamo. One of the things that happened in setting up Guantanamo that doesn't get enough attention is the shadow it cast over the American judicial system and its ability to try those who the United States deemed were worthy of standing trial for their role in terrorism and in 9/11. And basically, after Attorney General Eric Holder and Obama tried to move the important trials of Guantanamo Bay, including the trial of the suspected co-conspirators in the 9/11 attack, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and others, when he tried to move them to the United States, it fell apart for a number of reasons. The fact is, the United States has been unable to bring to trial the individuals who brought about the attacks of 9/11. And that is not just a lack of healing and a lack of closure for those who suffered from the attacks of 9/11, from the immediate victims to the country as a whole, but that is a way of continuing a vulnerability within a sense of the vulnerability within the American justice system. And the fact that backing away from the civilian courts for whatever reason, in this case, the reason is largely the fact that the evidence is weak and non-admissible because so much of it was garnered from torture. The fact that the United States cannot turn to its federal courts and say, just try these cases. We trust our courts. We trust the kind of evidence we have, whatever it is, and we're going to do this, is really one of the lingering things about what happens and one of the biggest lessons from violating these procedures and norms, which is, and this is sort of my ultimate takeaway, which is that when you break something as fundamental of these pieces of governance, what I would call the culture of governance, secrecy, imprecision in organizations, imprecision in language, and a willing and willful bypassing of longstanding norms and laws pertinent to procedures, what you really do is you break something that is not very easy to fix. And what we found in this country is that there hasn't been an appetite for fixing these things. There hasn't been an appetite for new laws and new rules and new regulations and new customs that say, this is what you can't do. This is what we are now saying is a violation of your oath as a public official. And until we do that, I think we're very much vulnerable to our democracy being hijacked by those who would wish it ill. I know that there's a lot of rhetoric in the news, international and domestic these days, about the chaos that's taking place in the United States. I actually think that we're finding our way to work towards reestablishing things we've lost. And unless you understand deeply how much we've lost in terms of norms and laws and just the customary sense of who we are, then you can't understand how hard it's going to be to go forward. You know what? The withdrawal from Afghanistan was messy, and the way forward in terms of addressing these subtle tools may also be messy, but it's necessary. So with that, I will take your questions.
Thank you so much, Karen Greenberg. You gave us a lot to think about and a lot of, I think a lot of people have a lot of questions. So we got one from via email. Okay, the question is, The policies implemented since 9/11 intended to combat terrorism are all focused on fighting quote unquote outside enemies. Do you think the language was intentionally used to distract Americans from internal societal illnesses that may threaten the future of American security even more than what they consider the stereotypical terrorist?
Well, this is very much at the heart of the debate going on in the United States right now. And I think it goes like this. First of all, the United States did not just focus on those outside, it focused on those inside, often with foreign ties to foreign terrorist organizations, right? Hence the domestic terrorism, the terrorism statute and its reliance on a foreign terrorist organization list, right? So we were always, the FBI and law enforcement was looking at home within for citizens and others who, identified with jihadist international causes to the point of wanting to bring about some kind of terrorist act. So there was always a sensitivity to that. The idea of can we transplant the international terrorism paradigm to the domestic terrorism one, I would suggest that we need to start from scratch and think about domestic terrorism in a different way. I think it has different indicators. And again, we will know more as we learn more from these cases that are now going through the system. I think it has different goals in mind. And I think we need to sort of start fresh. And the idea of for me, who's seen so much wrong with the institutional framework for responding to terrorism to start with, I think we need to rethink this. I also want to say that a lot of the laws we have on our books, both at the state level and at the federal level, are pertinent to the behavior of these who identify as domestic terrorisms, both in terms of statutes addressing violence, statutes that have to do with, as we know, insurrection, which hasn't been used, but that we have a number of statutes that can be used. I would say going forward, we need to use them. The further thing, and I think it underlies the question is there the will? Forget the methods. Is there the will to do this? And this is something we're now seeing fought out within the Department of Justice, within Congress, and I would say stay tuned.
All right, thank you. We have another question that we received via email, and it is, why do you think that Obama wasn't able to close Guantanamo?
This is the one that keeps me up at night, right? So I really do think he wanted to, as I said before. I think what happened was he got ahead of his skis. I think that he did not anticipate the political backlash that he would get. Remember, when Obama became president, it was possible to move detainees from Guantanamo to the United States, right? They moved one Guantanamo detainee, Obama and Attorney General Eric Holder, for a trial and conducted the trial, and he's serving time in prison. And it was one of the what we call high value detainees who was accused of a terrorist attack in East Africa against U.S. embassy. So it wasn't a minor case. And I think that what happened was he didn't anticipate the backlash. By the time he understood what the backlash was going to be, Congress had revved itself up to pass a law saying no Guantanamo detainee can be brought to the United States for any reason. And that was in 2011. And we still live with that. Every year they repass this in the Defense Authorization Act. So I think he didn't, what he should have, it's always easy in hindsight. I wish he had been quieter about doing it. I wish he had put in place many of the mechanisms to start with. He was well-intended in terms of understanding procedures that had been interrupted. He deployed three separate task forces to think about issues pertinent to Guantanamo and the Guantanamo detainees and who they were and how each one of their cases should be adjudicated, but it just took too long. And then the other thing he did was he paused the military commissions when he came in, and then agreed to restart them. And I think that was before there was any ban on bringing Guantanamo people to the detainees to this country for whatever reason. And so he lost the opportunity he chose to have the military commissions on the grounds, I'm sure, that he thought it would be too difficult to bring them to the federal courts.
Thank you. Now that we're on the topic of Guantanamo, we do have another question dealing with Guantanamo, however, in a more the comparative way. Can you compare the bypassing of procedural norms at Guantanamo with those at the detention centers on the US-Mexican border?
Yes. And yes, I can. And I've written about this. And I think that if somebody wanted to really look into us, they would be able to do this in some very interesting ways. When Donald Trump decided to look for his, person to oversee the border and immigration and DHS where it was housed, he turned to John Kelly. General Kelly had been the commander of Southcom, which oversees Guantanamo. What Donald Trump asked for, and you can read about this in my book, was somebody who would not be politically correct. The idea that the optics of seeing children in cages and families in cages, we called Guantanamo, is not a mistake in my mind. I think Guantanamo opened up possibilities in a whole range of things that then became part of the fabric of American policy. And we see this particularly clearly at the border. So yes, I also do want to point out that a couple of the judges at Guantanamo, one rather notoriously because he was negotiating with the Department of Justice for this job while he was still being a judge at Guantanamo, opted to become immigration judges. So I think if you wanted to build out this story more, you could, but let's just start with the optics and some of the appointments that overlapped and go from there.
Thank you, Karen. All right, we have a question looking into quoting something that you said. You said we cannot just look forward, but have to look into the past and see what was wrong, not only morally, but also by law. Can you illustrate what that could look like?
I knew someone was going to ask that question someday. Yeah, I think we need to have a study. I don't care if it's done inside the government or outside the government, but a government, some kind of investigation into actually what was broken in the war on terror. And it's okay with me if it names names. There don't have to be penalties associated with it, but there could be. I think we need to rethink. I think we really need to look into, for example, just to give you one, the Department of Justice has an office called the Office of Legal Counsel. It was established as a think tank to give advice on policies the government would like to do. Is it constitutional? Is it lawful? What will this mean in terms of domestic, international law? It became a rubber stamp for what the president wanted to do, including for conducting torture. Somebody needs to look at this office. Somebody needs to think about how to make supervision of this office in ways that we don't have. Just to give you one concrete example, I think there are a number of fissures in the administrational structure of the executive that need to be looked at. One of them is the one I referred to that just happened with the Department of Justice. The separation between the Department of Justice and the White House can't just be, a choice. It has to be something real and something that has regulations and limits and structures and boundaries. Same thing between the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security. It's had a tremendous effect, DOJ, in deploying DHS at the border and elsewhere. So just to give you some examples, I think there has to be a rethinking of what happened to our institutions and how it happened. And I think the sooner the better. And we've seen little bits and pieces of it, looking at torture, but we haven't looked at our culture of governance. And that's what I would think needs to be done.
Thank you. I hope that satisfied that person. You can ask in the chat again if you want to elaborate. But we have a question from email saying, doesn't it seem paradox that Republicans who argue for small government tend to support policies that actually expand the powers of government when it comes to defense?
Yeah, probably not just defense, but also law enforcement in some ways. It's never a consistent narrative, and it's certainly not in these days. And I do think, because we all know it's about, look, it's not just the Republican Party. Let me just say, people who have power want to use it to the extent that they can. So to blame the Republican Party, which is fine, given the state of the Republican Party right now, is to miss the point, which is that if you leave these things out there for constant abuse, they will get abused. And the narrative and the justification and the preferences from one presidency to another may change. So to expect parties to remain consistent about how they think about the abuse of power or the size of the Pentagon, whatever it is it's not fair. It's not fair to the system. And so what we need are a way to contain excess, no matter what either party thinks.
Thank you. We have one more question. If anybody else wants to ask a question, we still have time for a couple more questions. You can post them in the chat or send us an email to event@amerikahaus.de. Amerikahaus with a K, spelled German way, AMERIKAHUS.de. All right. Ms. Greenberg, you mentioned that you don't think there's an appetite, maybe not from politicians, but what about from the people?
I don't think there is an appetite. First of all, I don't think there's an understanding of what's happened. I think it's all been so messy and politically charged that people just want to forget about it. I think Guantanamo, to take an example, is offshore. It was put offshore for a reason. I bet there are a lot of people who don't even know that it still has the 39 prisoners that it has. I think the country's appetite is just not to have to get weighed down with thinking about these things. But I think that's largely because they're uneducated about what the costs are, which is very much why I wrote this book. It's just there has to be some kind of education that can be separate from the political discourse. And right now it's so hard to separate those that I think people just don't want to have to do it.
Well, not only that, but I think that another challenge right now when we're talking about challenges of democracy is that if more information on all of this is coming out, the challenge we have now is there's no basis of truth, knowing whether people want to believe it or not, or assuming that it's some kind of fake news from whatever side.
Well, that's actually one of the more interesting things about this, right? We can't really establish like a Mount Olympus, citadel of truth, right? That would be great, but we can't do that. And so that's something we're going to have to deal with. And that too comes down to education. There is such a thing as critical intelligence. And there is such a thing as of wanting to, first you have to want to know the truth. Right? You have to make it as delicious to know the truth as it is to know the not truth. And right now we're not there. And so this is a different kind of cultural challenge. It's one that I think is being thought about in very technical terms rather than in philosophical and terms. And so that's our next challenge. But I do think it comes down to a kind of social education and self-training.
It looks like at the moment we don't have any questions from the audience, but just, I guess, a question from me then. What do you think it will take for U.S. Americans to find that appetite?
Calming down, not having thrown in their face constantly, the world is coming to an end. Being able to say, we're doing what we can, we're moving along. Government is now boring again. Taking the drama out of every single day. We're not living under threat immediately. Yes, there's climate change. We're going to address it. Yes, there's terrorism. We're going to address it. Not using fear as a political cudgel, and just responsibly caring for people. And I think if that level of drama is taken out of it, people will automatically be able to think better. And then the kind of nurturing and guidance and sustenance that needs to happen for our children, not to mention ourselves, will happen.
I could not agree with you more on that point. It looks like we have no more questions, so I think we can come to a close now. Ms. Greenberg, Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. I really enjoyed it, and I think our audience enjoyed it as well. We posted a link in the chat to find Karen Greenberg's book. You can click on that. Thank you so much from Amerikahaus. Thank you to all of our audience. Oh, we have one last question. I think we can pose one last question. That's okay. What would you suggest would be the best way to educate?
I think the best way to educate, I mean, the obvious thing to want to say is the classroom. I don't think so. I think that a combination of classroom and really getting some kind of cultural buy-in to helping explain our world in a very, sort of like fun way is also very important. And that can interface with the classroom. But I think restoring, this is, will sound Obama-esque, but I mean it in a different, which is restoring a sense just that there is a future and that there is kind of hope. And I think that comes from a variety of cultural memes that can be in the classroom as well. And I think they will naturally come once everybody's not under pressure to buy in politically. And so this is, and I do think schools can help a great deal in this way. And because they ostensibly stay outside of the political fray, that wouldn't be a bad place to just begin exploring.
All right, thank you so much. And we do want to let you all know that Amerikahaus offers not only virtual events like this one, but we also have events live in our theater again. And this Thursday, we're hosting Jan van Amula. So come join us this Thursday evening at 7 p.m. Once again, Dr. Greenberg, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. And thank you all for joining us this morning, this evening, this afternoon, wherever you may be in the world. We were happy to have you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.